Subway is the world's largest fast food corporation. The chain surpassed McDonald's and KFC store counts decades ago and now has over 44,000 locations in 110 countries. And it all began with a 17-year-old from the Bronx who had never made a sub. He struggled for years before discovering a way to make billions. And it's all because of a scribbled message in a notebook. Fred DeLuca was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1947 to a factory worker and a housewife. When Fred was 5 years old, his family relocated to a Bronx housing project. It was an improvement over their previous basement apartment. 5 years later, the DeLucas had to pack their belongings. The company where Fred's father worked relocated yet again. As a result, the family was forced to relocate to Schenectady, New York, where life became more settled. A couple named Pete Buck and Ida Buck became close friends with the DeLucas. They frequently gathered their families for picnics and parties. However, when Fred graduated from high school, the two families lost contact. The DeLuca family was forced to relocate to Bridgeport, Connecticut. The Bucks relocated to Ulm, New York, about 40 miles from Bridgeport, a year later. When they had settled into their new home, they invited the DeLuca over. Fred had graduated from high school and was planning to become a doctor at the time. He was offered a place in a pre-med program, but he was unsure whether he should accept. My family's financial situation made it unlikely that I would be able to complete college. It was a good job for a kid, but it wasn't going to pay for my college education. Fred was depressed until he went to see the Bucks' new house, a large white house with 2 garages. Fred hoped Pete would extend him a loan. Fred stood in the middle of Pete's lawn all afternoon, waiting for an opportunity to speak with Pete alone. "I want to go to college, but I don't have the funds, and I was wondering if you had any suggestions for how I could pay for it." Still, Fred was intrigued and inquired as to how the business operated. "Customers will come in and leave money on the counter, and you'll have enough money for college." Pete walked into his house, pulled out a newspaper clipping, and began reading an article about Mike. Fred thought it was a fantastic opportunity and agreed. Pete handed Fred his first investment, a $1,000 check, 10 years before he returned home. They had no idea it would result in a $1 billion return or that they would have to first go nearly a decade without making a profit. Fred found a small shop to rent the next day in Bridgeport. Customers had difficulty finding the location, but it was in good condition and affordable to Fred and Pete. Within 5 minutes, they had reached an agreement with the landlord. They didn't even bother signing a lease because they thought hiring a lawyer to draft a contract would be too expensive. Following that, Fred and Pete went on a trip to learn the art of making subs. Pete was from Portland and grew up eating subs from Amado's, a local Italian deli. So he suggested that they come by and observe their operations before weighing the pros and cons. They went to other shops and did the same thing. When they compared notes, they discovered that Mike's and Amato's are their favorites. Mike's had a wider selection of subs and made them with foot-long rolls. Amato also used a blend of olive and vegetable oils to enhance the flavor of its subs. Fred and Pete decided to pool their resources and sell their subs at the same price as Mike's. They had no idea about pricing but figured it was a safe bet given Mike's 32 locations. Fred whipped out flyers and handed them to strangers who had pulled over on a street corner. Every driver he asked would look over and inform Fred that Pete's Submarines officially opened for business on August 28, 1965. It was the first time in Fred's life that he had ever made a sub to make things worse. He had an English exam on the first day, so he had no choice but to rely on his friend Art Witkowski. When Fred returned to the shop, he was surprised to see that the parking lot was completely full. He couldn't believe his eyes when he looked over at the shop. By 6 p.m., customers were crammed inside and waiting in line outside. They sold over 300 subs before having to close their doors for the day due to a lack of ingredients. Fred and Pete were certain that their first customers would return and that sales would soar. Pete insisted that they bring their friends the next time. "We're going to make $1 million." Unfortunately, their first customers never returned, only a few new customers came in each month, and sales plummeted. Fred and Pete brainstormed ways to boost sales and even paid for an expensive radio ad. Each and every one of them failed. Fred and Pete eventually found themselves unable to pay their rent or employees. Later on, it reshaped the entire fast food industry. Fred was surprised by the shop. Pete stated that it was only 6 months old and that it was too soon to abandon it. There had to be another way. Pete quickly realized Fred was correct. They discussed various options for saving the business and decided on the most unusual one: opening a second shop. They reasoned that having a second store would allow them to experiment with different products and compare the results. And that having 2 shops would give the impression that their subs were in high demand. While it was a big risk, moving the restaurant to a new location didn't make sense. They had already paid for renovations and would have to pay to have their equipment reinstalled. Pete's Submarines, a second shop, opened a few months later in Fairfield, Connecticut. Because it was so successful, Fred and Pete decided to open a third location. Sales increased immediately at all 3 locations that year. Fred and Pete boasted that having more restaurants was unquestionably preferable to having just one. But, as soon as they realized they had spoken too soon, sales plummeted as winter approached, and they now had not 1, but 3 failing stores. Fred and Pete recognized that their company was highly seasonal. To save money, most people did not eat out every day and stayed at home during the holidays. Nonetheless, Fred and Pete refused to give up and chose to wait it out. Fortunately, their perseverance paid off, sales increased by spring, and business became more stable over time as the restaurant's reputation grew and customers' eating habits changed. Fred had given up on his dream of becoming a doctor by that point. He discovered that he disliked lab work and changed his major from pre-med to psychology because it was the only department that would accept his course credits. He just wanted to graduate, and figure out his career later. Meanwhile, he remained committed to his and Pete's goal of opening 32 restaurants in 10 years. By the 8th year of Pete's Submarines, Fred had managed to open 16 restaurants. He realized he couldn't go from 16 to 32 in 2 years. So he sought advice from William Rosenberg, the founder of Dunkin' Donuts, who paved the way for McDonald's and KFC. William began franchising Dunkin' Donuts over a decade ago and later founded the International Franchise Association. Fred was encouraged by William to open shops and parking lots, and he insisted on starting a franchise. Fred took his advice and changed the company name to something more memorable, such as Subway. When Subway reached its 10th year, it was several restaurants short of its goal of 32, but it still managed to open over 5,000 restaurants over the next decade. After that, Fred considered his job at Subway to be his career, and the company's success skyrocketed. When a college student named Jared Fogle lost 245 pounds after eating Subway subs for a year, the company made headlines. Jared soon became an underground ambassador. His everyday job quality drew many Americans in and persuaded them that taking the underground was a healthy option, tripling the company's sales. 3 years later, a Subway franchisee named Stuart Frankel devised an idea that increased the company's profits: $5 foot-long subs. Stuart's weekly sales increased from $14,000 to $23,000 after testing the promotion. 4 times as much as the average shop brought in. Corporate was initially skeptical that the promotion would work on a national scale, but eventually relented. It eventually brought in billions of dollars before becoming a household name. Fred shares one of the most important business lessons he's learned in his book. Most people don't believe that ordinary people with ordinary ideas and limited resources can accomplish such feats. Wouldn't they be more surprised by how the real world works than by how money is created? That's all there is to it. This is the story of how a 17-year-old from the Bronx opened a Subway and turned it into a multi-billion-dollar multinational corporation. Which of the following facts was your favorite in this video? Let us know in the comments. Also don't forget to turn on the notification bell, like and subscribe for more.